Sparks flew today on Capitol Hill as White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt faced off against Representative Jasmine Crockett in a searing exchange over Crockett's incendiary remarks about Elon Musk and recent Tesla arson attacks. The tension? Palpable. Washington, D.C. was already bracing for political tremors, but no one expected the shockwaves that would ripple through the Rayburn House office building this morning. As cameras clicked and pens scribbled, the air inside the chamber was electric. The House Oversight Committee had convened for what was supposed to be a procedural review of federal responses to political violence and corporate targeting, but it quickly devolved into something far more combustible. At the center of the firestorm, a clash between two distinctly different political figures: the poised and calculated Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, and the ever-outspoken Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The moment Karoline entered the chamber, it was clear she hadn't come just to testify. She came to challenge, and the room knew it. Within minutes, the hearing veered away from dry bureaucratic language into a volatile confrontation, as Karoline directly addressed the elephant in the room. Congresswoman Crockett's explosive comments made just days earlier, during a live stream with local Texas activists. "I don't care how much money that man has," Crockett had said of Elon Musk. "He's poisoning this country with his power. He must be taken down. And if the people have to send a message, then so be it." Her words had already ignited a firestorm, both figuratively and, as it turns out, literally. Within 48 hours of her statements, a Tesla dealership in Fort Worth went up in flames in what authorities now suspect was a politically motivated arson attack. This was not a one-off. 2 more attempted firebombings at Tesla supercharging stations in Arizona and Nevada followed, with suspects allegedly found in possession of manifestos citing Musk's dangerous influence. But Crockett hadn't walked back her comments. In fact, when pressed, she doubled down, saying, "It's time Elon Musk got what's coming to him," and suggesting that the arson attacks were a symbol of public outrage. When asked whether she condoned the violence, she deflected. "As a black woman, I understand the need to be heard when institutions refuse to listen." Karoline Leavitt wasn't having it. Sitting across from Crockett, her expression unreadable but her voice razor-sharp, Karoline leaned into the microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett's language is not just irresponsible, it's dangerous," she began, her tone calm but firm. "When an elected official casually implies that a private citizen must be taken down, and follows it with tacit support for violent acts, we are not talking about hyperbole. We are talking about a green light for extremism." Crockett rolled her eyes and adjusted her mic. "Excuse me, Ms. Leavitt," she interrupted, "but I find it offensive that you're trying to lecture me, someone who has lived through systemic oppression, on what outrage looks like." Karoline didn't blink. "I'm not lecturing you. I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference." The room fell into a stunned silence. Karoline continued, referencing the ongoing DOJ investigation. 3 suspects are now facing severe charges for arson and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. Their statements echo your rhetoric. If you cannot draw a clear line between impassioned speech and inciting violence, then perhaps you're not fit to serve in this chamber. Crockett tried to pivot, launching into a passionate tangent about white billionaires exploiting the system and how black voices are always policed more harshly. She invoked her background, her community, her identity, as she often does, to frame her statements as misunderstood rather than malicious. But Karoline was prepared. "You consistently use your identity to shield yourself from criticism," she said, addressing the committee now. "When you're caught saying something indefensible, suddenly it's not about your words. It's about how you're a black woman being targeted. That's not accountability. That's manipulation." Crockett fired back. "So now you're tone policing me?" Classic. Karoline shook her head. "No, I'm calling out double standards. If a white male congressman had called for violence against a black CEO, they'd be censured, investigated, and probably forced to resign. And yet here we are, debating whether, or not your words, encouraging the destruction of private property and inciting violence, deserve even an apology. Whispers swirled around the room. Several representatives were visibly shaken. Others glanced nervously at the press gallery. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett, who, for a moment, seemed to falter. But her defiance returned quickly. "You're twisting my words," she said. "I'm quoting them," Karoline replied, without missing a beat. The tension in the room thickened, as Karoline shifted the focus to a pattern of behavior. "This is not an isolated incident," she said. "This is the same congresswoman who just last month mocked a disabled American during a speech, referring to Governor Abbott as Hot Wheels, a man paralyzed in a tragic accident. And she still refused to apologize. That wasn't an off-the-cuff remark. That was cruelty wrapped in performance." Crockett leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, but Karoline wasn't done. She needs to unequivocally denounce the violence. She must apologize immediately, not just to Texans, but to every American who believes in civil discourse and the rule of law. And she must be investigated for what is, quite frankly, the organizing of political violence through rhetoric. The chairman of the committee attempted to interject, but the room was now caught in a quiet uproar, whispers echoing from side to side. "And Congresswoman Crockett," Karoline said, locking eyes with her across the aisle, "you should tread carefully. This administration is committed to cracking down on threats made against American citizens, no matter who makes them." The words landed like a gavel, and just as the committee moved to call the next witness, a staffer handed Karoline a sealed, manila envelope. She opened it, read its contents, and her eyes narrowed. "The Justice Department," she said, rising slowly from her chair, "has just upgraded charges against one of the Tesla arson suspects, and there's a new development tying that individual to a political action group publicly endorsed by Congresswoman Crockett." Gasps filled the room. The hearing was no longer about rhetoric. It was about what came next. All eyes zeroed in on Karoline Leavitt as she held the manila envelope in one hand, her voice even, deliberate, but carrying the unmistakable gravity of someone who had just detonated a political bomb in real time. "I've just received confirmation," she said, raising the document slightly. "The Department of Justice has linked one of the suspects arrested in the Fort Worth Tesla arson to the organization People for Equal Systems, a political action group known to have received verbal endorsements, financial contributions, and social amplification from Representative Crockett." A wave of audible reactions rolled across the chamber. The name People for Equal Systems wasn't unfamiliar. It had made headlines for a series of coordinated protests outside private tech campuses, but until this moment, no one had connected it to an act of domestic terrorism. Karoline's eyes remained fixed on Crockett. "Congresswoman, would you like to revise your earlier statements before we enter this into the record?" Crockett's jaw visibly tightened. "That group is independent. I don't control what people do in the streets," she said, forcing a tight smile. "You're trying to create guilt by association." "No, I'm trying to protect Americans from being targeted by ideologically motivated violence," Karoline's countered. "There is a direct line between words and action. You didn't just express frustration, you said, 'Elon Musk must be taken down.' That's not critique. That's a call to action." Crockett's tone sharpened. "You want to paint me as a villain because I dared to speak out against billionaires who manipulate democracy and silence marginalized voices." Karoline turned toward the committee members. "Let the record show that even now Congresswoman Crockett refuses to condemn acts of arson and terrorism. She frames them as part of a social struggle, rather than what they truly are: crimes." She didn't wait for a response. Karoline flipped, opened the folder and pulled out a printed screenshot of a tweet, placing it before the committee. This is from the official account of People for Equal Systems 2 days before the Fort Worth attack. It reads, quote, "When those in power ignore the people, fire speaks. We don't need permission to act. It's time to torch the systems that protect tyrants like Musk." Then she held up another photo, this time of Congresswoman Crockett at a rally, flanked by members of the group, their banner visible behind her. Her expression was one of solidarity, her fist raised. "You stood beside them," Karoline said. "You called them freedom fighters. You promoted their events on your official House account. And now you want to feign distance?" Crockett snapped back, her voice rising. "That's a smear campaign and you know it. I've never advocated for violence. And I won't apologize for standing with people who are sick of the status quo." "And yet," Karoline pressed, "you mock a disabled governor with a slur. You excuse arson by calling it symbolic outrage. You threaten a private citizen and CEO with vague calls for justice. Your pattern isn't one of misunderstanding. It's one of escalation." The chairman finally broke in, trying to settle the rising tide of tension. "Let's maintain decorum." But Karoline kept speaking, clearly beyond the point of formality. "This isn't just about Tesla or Elon Musk. This is about a sitting member of Congress contributing to a political atmosphere where violence is seen as justified if it targets the right person." Crockett scoffed. "And yet when far-right extremists stormed the Capitol, your party called them tourists. Spare me the moral lecture." Karoline didn't flinch. "I wasn't working for the White House during the Capitol riots, Congresswoman, but I am now, and let me be clear. This administration is charging everyone who crosses that line. We've called out threats, left and right. But you want immunity because of your identity, your district, your politics. That's not justice. That's entitlement." The tension in the room became suffocating. "I don't need a lecture from someone who's barely old enough to rent a car," Crockett sneered. "I may be young," Karoline said coolly, "but I didn't build my career on playing the victim. I came here to demand accountability, something you seem to view as optional." That silenced even the murmurs. Karoline turned back to the committee. "We are facing a moment where our institutions must decide if violence is ever acceptable, based on who commits it and who it targets. If not, if we're truly committed to equal justice, then this chamber must demand a formal censure of Congresswoman Crockett, because her refusal to denounce political violence endangers every American." The chairman looked visibly rattled, turning to his aides for direction. Cameras panned to Crockett, who leaned back in her seat, arms folded, fuming, but silent. "And let's not pretend this is over," Karoline added. "The DOJ has made it clear. There will be more arrests, more charges, more exposure of the networks enabling this violence. And if those networks lead here, if they lead to this very room, then so be it." A pause fell over the room like a fog. Crockett suddenly leaned forward again. "You're playing with fire, Leavitt. You're coming into my house and trying to humiliate me on national television. But don't forget, I'm still the elected official here. You're just a mouthpiece." Karoline stared at her. "And you're right. I am a mouthpiece. But I speak for a White House that will not tolerate double standards or threats of violence, whether from anonymous trolls online or from members of Congress. You chose your words. Now you face the consequences." Crockett opened her mouth to respond, but the chairman slammed the gavel. "We're calling a recess," he said. "Effective immediately." But the damage had already been done. Outside the hearing chamber, media was already swarming. Aides scrambled. Phones buzzed like hornets in a nest. Staffers whispered updates into the ears of committee members as new headlines broke. Karoline stepped out of the chamber calmly, flashing a brief diplomatic smile at the press pack. She said nothing. Her statements had already detonated across every network in the country. And inside, Jasmine Crockett remained in her seat, eyes burning, jaw clenched, as a Capitol police officer whispered something in her ear that made her face drain of color. The whispers were no longer just in the chamber. The investigation was widening. By the time Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett emerged from the hearing chamber, the rotunda outside had transformed into a media crucible. Reporters lined the velvet ropes with microphones stretched out like weapons. Shouts of, "Congresswoman, do you condone the arson?" and "Did you financially back people for equal systems?" echoed against the marble walls. Crockett didn't answer. Her jaw was locked, sunglasses on despite the low-lit hall, and aides formed a tight wall around her as they pushed toward the elevators. But inside her office, the storm had already broken. The Capitol Police briefing, delivered quietly but bluntly just minutes earlier, had dropped a bombshell. The DOJ had subpoenaed internal communications from multiple progressive PICs tied to Crockett's political network, and one of her former campaign consultants, Brent Laney, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity. Laney had already turned over encrypted chat logs. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, wasn't resting. In a secure room adjacent to the White House press corps, she stood with DOJ liaison staff, poring over documents while headlines continued to flare. Across national news tickers, Crockett under federal scrutiny, DOJ links, PAC to Tesla, arson ringleader. Her phone buzzed every few seconds, staffers confirming talking points, congressional aides requesting off-the-record clarifications, but Karoline wasn't interested in spin. She was preparing to go back in. The hearing was set to resume in under an hour, and she knew the next stage would define not just this confrontation, but how political violence would be treated moving forward in a deeply divided country. Back inside the Capitol, tensions had only grown thicker. Some Democrats privately fumed over Crockett's escalating liabilities, whispering to one another behind closed doors about how much damage her refusal to walk anything back was doing. Others, particularly members of the progressive wing, doubled down, issuing statements defending her as a truth-teller under siege by institutional powers. But the weight of evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. When the hearing reconvened, Crockett was already seated, staring ahead, trying to regain composure. Karoline entered moments later, flanked by two senior legal aides. Her demeanor was unchanged, measured, composed, but the determination in her gaze said everything. The chairman wasted no time. "We will resume testimony regarding recent political violence and any elected officials potentially tied to incitement or endorsement of said violence." Karoline stood, cleared her throat, and spoke again. "No notes this time. I'd like to submit into the record a document recently made available by DOJ investigators. It is a private group message from an encrypted channel used by people for equal systems. The message, dated 3 days before the Fort Worth Tesla fire, reads," She paused only slightly, then read aloud, "Congresswoman C gave the green light. Time to act. Time to send a message to the tyrants." The silence that followed was like vacuum-sealed tension. "I will not speculate on the identity of Congresswoman C," Karoline added, her eyes locked on Crockett, "but I believe this committee has a responsibility to investigate thoroughly. Because when people begin acting on what they believe to be political permission, we cross from speech into sedition." Crockett slammed her palm on the table. "That's not admissible evidence. That message could have been fabricated, misattributed. There's no proof that's me." "And yet," Karoline said, "you have yet to deny that you told members of that group that Elon Musk must be taken down. You continue to refuse to condemn the violence. You refuse to denounce the arsons. And now we have messages suggesting your words were perceived as authorization." "You're twisting everything," Crockett snapped. "You're building a witch hunt out of speculation." "No," Karoline said calmly. "We're building accountability out of your own actions." At that moment, Representative Alicia Hernandez, a moderate Democrat from Arizona, who had remained quiet up to that point, leaned toward her microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, Do you categorically deny ever communicating privately with members of People for Equal Systems? The room collectively inhaled. Crockett faltered. I don't recall specific conversations. I meet with dozens of groups. But did you or did you not exchange encrypted messages with members of that group in the weeks leading up to the attack? Hernandez pressed. I'd have to check with my staff. The murmurs began again. It wasn't just Republicans now. The wall was cracking. Karoline seized the opening. This isn't just about Elon Musk. This is about whether elected officials think they can stoke violence and then hide behind ambiguity. Whether they believe their rhetoric is exempt from consequences. Whether some communities must endure terrorism silently because their attackers fit the right narrative. She paused. We can't let political convenience replace moral clarity. Crockett tried one last time to pivot. You want to drag me through the mud? But where was this outrage when tech billionaires manipulated elections or silenced speech? Why is it only political violence when it's a Tesla factory? What about the people left behind by this system? Karoline nodded slightly. That's a debate worth having, she said. But not while buildings are burning. Not while you encourage violence as a means of protest. And certainly not while you pretend victimhood shields you from responsibility. Then she dropped the final piece of her testimony for the day. We have just confirmed through DOJ correspondence that Mr. Laney, your former campaign strategist, has provided digital records connecting one of your campaign PAC events to funding used for a logistics operation later linked to the Tesla arson network. Your office promoted the event. The funds were transferred within 48 hours. You may not have lit the match, Congresswoman, but you built the stage where it happened. Crockett stood, visibly shaken now. I want to speak with counsel, she snapped. You should, Karoline said. Because this isn't just a hearing anymore. It's a reckoning. The chairman adjourned the session once again, early this time. Tensions had escalated beyond the scope of questioning. The press outside now surged like a tidal wave, capturing Crockett's hurried exit as aides shielded her from the barrage. Back at the White House, Karoline declined all interviews. She didn't need to speak. The evidence was speaking loud enough, but what she knew, and what no one else yet did, was that the DOJ's next steps weren't just about subpoenas. Indictments were coming, and someone in Crockett's inner circle was about to flip. By the next morning, the Hill was buzzing. Not just with press, but with panic. Inside the Cannon House office building, doors were shut tighter than usual. Aides spoke in hushed tones, and a heavy sense of dread clung to the hallways. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It was real. It was closing in. At 8:43 a.m., a sealed motion was filed in federal court under the DOJ's Domestic Terrorism Task Force. At the same time, federal agents served a subpoena to the Capitol office of Representative Jasmine Crockett, an unprecedented move, especially for an active member of Congress. But what shook Washington even more was who the motion named in its supporting affidavit: Jayla Haynes, Crockett's longtime chief of staff and closest political confidant. Jayla wasn't just another aide. She was Crockett's architect, the one who drafted her speeches, brokered relationships with progressive coalitions, ran social media operations, and quietly liaised with non-affiliated grassroots groups, including People for Equal Systems. For years, she'd been the unflinching operator behind the firebrand Congresswoman's public persona, and now she was cooperating with federal investigators. Karoline Leavitt received the update in a classified morning briefing. She scanned the memo, lips pressed into a line. "They have her," she murmured to her deputy. "This is going to get ugly." Ugly didn't begin to cover it. Jayla had turned herself in the previous night under a negotiated immunity deal, submitting over 11,000 text messages, audio files, and encrypted emails. One of those files, according to DOJ investigators, was a voice memo from Crockett herself, sent in a group chat with Jayla and Brent Laney. The message was time-stamped the night before the Fort Worth arson. You think the system listens? It doesn't. Maybe it needs to feel the heat. If someone hits Musk where it hurts, maybe then they'll start listening. But don't say I said that. It was the kind of statement that, in another time, might have been brushed off as venting. But not now. Not when people had already acted on her words. Not when 3 men were facing federal charges for domestic terrorism. And now, those men had legal teams pointing to Crockett and her circle as inspiration, if not instigation. The Oversight Committee reconvened an emergency session that afternoon. What was supposed to be a multi-week series of hearings had now snowballed into a high-stakes live political trial. Karoline returned to the Capitol with an unflinching focus. She wasn't there to speculate anymore. She was there to dismantle. The cameras rolled. Karoline took her seat and was granted additional time to present supplemental evidence. She stood holding a single printed sheet. "This document," she said, "is a sworn affidavit by a federal investigator attesting to the authenticity of a voice memo attributed to Representative Crockett, discussing Elon Musk and making veiled suggestions of violent retaliation. This affidavit is now part of a sealed federal case, but the contents are admissible in this hearing due to their relevance and urgency." Gasps spread across the room like brushfire. Crockett's seat was conspicuously empty. Karoline anticipated the obvious question. Congresswoman Crockett was subpoenaed to appear again today. Her office has claimed a medical emergency has prevented her attendance. She paused. But we now know the real emergency lies in her crumbling defense. Representative Tim Rowe, a senior member of the committee and former prosecutor, interjected. "Is it true that her own chief of staff has entered a cooperation agreement?" Karoline nodded. "Yes. Jayla Haynes, who managed all external communications and political strategy for the Congresswoman, has surrendered all correspondence and verified coordination with members of People for Equal Systems, before and after the attacks, including financial documentation tied to a PAC event promoted by the Congresswoman that indirectly funded a logistics cell now implicated in at least 2 arson attempts." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Karoline leaned forward, slightly. "This goes beyond rhetoric, beyond protest. This was infrastructure. Political scaffolding propping up violent extremism under the guise of social justice." A murmur ran through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even Democratic members who had staunchly defended Crockett looked suddenly pale, their alliances beginning to fracture. But it was Representative Alicia Hernandez who dealt the next blow. She cleared her throat and looked directly at the chairman. "Given the volume of evidence presented, I propose we initiate a formal inquiry into Congresswoman Crockett's conduct, with the potential recommendation for censure and referral to the House Ethics Committee. Further, I believe we must consider whether her words and actions rise to the level of incitement as defined under federal statute." It was a stunning turn. A Democrat calling for formal inquiry into a fellow party member. On live television. Karoline didn't speak. She didn't need to. The committee voted 9-3 to proceed with the inquiry. Outside reporters rushed to their vans. Breaking: Congressional inquiry into Crockett, voted through. Civil War bruise. Inside Democratic caucus scrolled across every network. But inside Jasmine Crockett's office, the fallout was becoming apocalyptic. Her staffers were packing up. Doors were being closed. Her legal team was on the phone with crisis PR firms, but the damage was already bleeding into public opinion. Polls released that afternoon showed a 17-point drop in approval in her district, unheard of for a sitting congresswoman. And then came the final dagger. Karoline stepped before the press outside the Capitol and issued her strongest statement. Yet, let's be clear, political violence is not activism. It is not protected speech. And no elected official, no matter their identity, district, or political affiliation, is above the law. If we allow our leaders to encourage destruction, without consequences, we are no longer governed by justice. We are governed by spectacle. She turned and walked away as reporters shouted questions behind her. In the following hours, DOJ officials confirmed the existence of a fourth suspect in custody. This one alleged to have received encrypted payment. Instructions from a burner phone traced to the same IP address used by Jayla Haynes. The circle was closing. Inside a secured briefing room that evening, Karoline reviewed final documentation from DOJ task force liaisons. Her eyes paused on one phrase, bolded in red. Recommendation to pursue criminal referral of Representative Crockett under Title 18, Section 2101, inciting a riot. She closed the folder and looked up. Send it to the committee. Karoline Leavitt closed the folder with finality. The room was still, quiet, like the eye of a hurricane, but the silence buzzed with consequence. The DOJ had done its job. Now the responsibility fell squarely on Congress to confront one of its own. The criminal referral for Representative Jasmine Crockett had been officially transmitted to the House Ethics Committee and the Department of Justice. The charge, inciting a riot under federal law, aided by political organizations and incendiary rhetoric that had, according to investigators, directly contributed to criminal acts of domestic terrorism. It was a moment of gravity Washington hadn't seen in decades. A sitting member of Congress not just censured, not just under inquiry, but recommended for criminal prosecution. And the nation was watching, breathless. The Ethics Committee convened in a special closed-door session that same evening. Despite the attempts from Crockett's remaining loyalists to delay or deflect, the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from Jayla Haynes, bank transfers linked to campaign events, intercepted group messages, and the now infamous voice memo from Crockett herself all painted the same picture. A reckless use of language turned operational support, blurred, just enough to avoid a direct order, but potent enough to inspire real destruction. For 3 hours the committee interrogated the record line by line, but when the doors finally opened and the decision was read aloud, no one was surprised. Recommendation for expulsion from the United States House of Representatives. Karoline received the alert while standing outside the press briefing room. She took a moment before walking to the podium. No smugness, no celebration, just the cool, sharp edge of justice being fulfilled. When the cameras turned on, she spoke clearly, without notes. This has never been about vengeance. This has never been about scoring points. This has been about restoring the principle that words, especially from our elected leaders, carry weight. Congresswoman Crockett crossed a line that no title, no background, no identity can protect her from. And while this decision today is painful, it is necessary. Because if we let this slide, if we excuse or rationalize or distract from what she did, then we are telling every American that there are two systems of justice, one for the connected and one for everyone else. By now, Crockett had returned to the Capitol, not by choice, but because she was summoned. Her attorneys advised her to speak before the full House one last time before the vote on her expulsion. What followed was a desperate, defiant performance. She stood at the well of the House, shoulders square, eyes fierce. "This is a political hit job," she said. "I've been targeted because I challenge the elite, because I speak truths others won't. This is a punishment for passion, not a prosecution for crime." But there was no fire left in the chamber, no applause, no swelling voices of solidarity, and when the vote came down, it was definitive. To 104. Jasmine Crockett was expelled from the United States Congress. The news swept the nation. Headlines lit up. Crockett expelled. Ethics Committee fines. Her complicit in Tesla arson network. Social media was ablaze with both outrage and relief, but among lawmakers, a stunned stillness set in. For some, it was a moment of reckoning. For others, a warning shot. Karoline returned to the White House that night, her team silent during the drive. She stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Not once did she gloat. She didn't need to. Justice, she believed, didn't need theatrics. The following morning, she took the podium in the White House press briefing room for the first time since Crockett's expulsion. The room was packed. "Today, we close a chapter," she began, not with triumph, but with accountability. Let this moment stand as a reminder. Leadership is not about spectacle. It's about truth. And when those in power weaponize their words to spark chaos, there must be consequences, no matter who they are, where they come from, or how loudly they shout. A reporter raised his hand. "Karoline, critics say this sets a dangerous precedent. That free speech, especially for marginalized voices, is under threat. What do you say to that?" She nodded. She had expected the question. Free speech means you can speak your mind. It does not mean you can incite violence and evade responsibility. What Congresswoman Crockett did was not protest. It was provocation. Words have consequences, not just for the people who say them, but for the people they influence. That's not censorship. That's accountability. Outside the chamber, demonstrators both for and against the decision filled the streets. But as the days passed, the country slowly exhaled. The DOJ confirmed additional indictments in the Tesla arson ring. People for Equal Systems shuttered its operations under federal scrutiny. And for the first time in months, the fire that had engulfed national politics began to dim. Karoline Leavitt's name now carried weight far beyond the White House. Editorials ran titles like "The Adult in the Room" and "Leavitt's Law: Accountability Returns to Washington." Even her critics acknowledged her unwavering poise in the face of outrage. But to Karoline, the real victory wasn't headlines. It was precedent. In the months that followed, Congress passed a bipartisan resolution condemning political violence in all forms, reaffirming that no ideology, no identity, no frustration justified destruction. As for Jasmine Crockett, she withdrew. From public life, her legal team now focused solely on avoiding a federal trial. She released a statement weeks later, vague and defiant, blaming a broken system. But the public had moved on. The story had ended. Washington remained imperfect, messy, volatile, human. But something had shifted. There was now a line that had been drawn again. A line that mattered, and standing at the center of it, not with theatrics, but with resolve, was Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in American history. But now, also one of its most consequential.